Somewhere in the fields of northern France, a man sat in absolute darkness for 11 hours, starving, his throat burning with thirst, listening to German voices drift through a hole the size of a coin. He couldn't move. He couldn't cough. He couldn't even shift his weight without risking the grain beneath him singing out his position. And in those 11 hours, he became the most dangerous man the Wehrmacht never saw coming. A farm boy from Wisconsin who would quietly rewrite the rules of modern warfare, one impossible shot at a time, from inside a place no soldier had ever thought to hide. The morning of June 18, 1944, began with mist rolling across the hedgerows of Normandy like something out of a half-remembered dream. Sergeant Jacob Mertens pressed his eye to the scope of his Kar 98K rifle, scanning the tree line for movement, for the glint of metal, for anything that might betray an American position. He had survived 3 years of the Eastern Front, had earned his Iron Cross in the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, and carried himself with the cold professionalism of a man who understood that war was simply a matter of who saw whom first. The fields before him were pockmarked with shell craters, the bocage thick and tangled, perfect country for ambush. He adjusted his position slightly, settling into the worn groove of the farmhouse windowsill, his breathing slow and controlled. Somewhere out there, the Americans were dug in, and it was his job to find them before they found him. He had done this 1,000 times. He would do it 1,000 more. The scope's crosshairs drifted across a distant barn, then toward the base of a grain silo rising like a gray finger against the pale sky. Nothing. Just fields. Just silence. Then, in the span of a single heartbeat, Jacob Mertens ceased to exist. The bullet arrived before the sound, punching through the center of his forehead with surgical precision, and he slumped forward against the window frame without even the dignity of surprise. 300 yards away, Technical Sergeant Raymond Kuzlowski didn't celebrate. He didn't whisper a prayer or count the kill on his fingers. He simply worked the bolt of his Springfield, the metallic click swallowed by the vast darkness of the grain silo's interior, and shifted his eye back to the narrow slit he had carved into the wooden wall. 24, he thought. 24 officers in 6 days. And the Germans still had no idea where he was. Ray Kuzlowski had been inside the silo for 11 hours by the time he took that shot. 11 hours of sitting perfectly still in pitch blackness, his back pressed against the curved wall, his legs cramped beneath him on the uneven surface of old grain and rotted wood. He had one canteen, nearly empty now, and a K-ration bar he'd eaten in the first hour just to stop his stomach from growling loud enough to give him away. The silo smelled of dust and mildew and something faintly sweet that might have been wheat or might have been decay. It was hot during the day, suffocating in a way that made his uniform stick to his skin, and cold at night in a manner that seeped into his bones. There were no windows except for the ventilation slots near the top, long thin gaps in the wood that let in slivers of light but nothing more. He had chosen this position 3 days earlier, crawling into the silo under cover of darkness with nothing but his rifle, a single sandbag for stabilization, a knife, and the unshakable conviction that farms were the key to everything. He had grown up on a dairy farm outside of Rhinelander, Wisconsin, where silos were as common as fence posts, and he knew their structure intimately. He knew how thick the walls were, how the wood and metal could stop shrapnel, how the height gave you a vantage point that no trench or rooftop could match. Most importantly, he knew that nobody ever looked at a silo and thought, sniper. They thought, grain. They thought, livestock. They thought, civilian structure not worth the ammunition. And that oversight was going to cost the Wehrmacht dearly. The first thing Ray had done after slipping inside was to cut a viewing port. Not a window, not a loophole, but a slit barely wider than his thumb, positioned just high enough that he could observe the German positions without exposing himself to return fire. He used his trench knife for the work, carving slowly, methodically, shaving away thin strips of wood and letting them fall silently into the grain below. It took him 40 minutes to create an opening that satisfied him, and when he finally pressed his eye to the gap, the world beyond snapped into focus with startling clarity. He could see the farmhouse where Mertens would eventually die. He could see the machine gun nest tucked into the hedgerow to the east, the mortar team dug in behind the stone wall to the south, the command tent half hidden beneath camouflage netting near the road. He could see 37 distinct German positions, and as the hours passed and the sun climbed higher, he began to identify which soldiers moved with authority, which ones carried maps, which ones other soldiers deferred to. Officers, radio operators, squad leaders, men whose deaths would create chaos rather than merely reduce numbers. He cataloged them mentally, noting their routines, their patterns, the moments when they grew careless and stepped into the open. And then, one by one, he began to kill them. The first officer died on the second day. A lieutenant, young and eager, who made the mistake of standing fully upright to point at something on a map. Ray's bullet caught him in the chest, and he dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The men around him scattered, shouting, diving for cover, their eyes scanning the tree line, the rooftops, the hedgerows, everywhere except up. Everywhere except the silent gray tower that had been part of the landscape since before any of them arrived. Ray waited for the chaos to subside, his breathing steady, his hands motionless on the rifle. He didn't fire again that day. Patience was the essence of farm work, the slow accumulation of small tasks that eventually yielded a harvest, and he applied that same logic here. Let them think it was a lucky shot. Let them relax. Let them believe the danger had passed. The next officer died the following morning, a captain who stepped out of the farmhouse to light a cigarette. And this time the reaction was more frantic. Snipers were common in Normandy, but 2 precision kills from what seemed like the same angle suggested something organized, something deliberate. The Germans began to fortify, to move more cautiously, to send out patrols to sweep the surrounding area. They searched the hedgerows. They checked the barn. They even posted sentries in the upper floors of nearby buildings. But nobody climbed the silo. Nobody even looked at it twice. It was just a farm structure, weathered and ordinary, part of the rural backdrop that nobody ever questioned. Ray's innovation wasn't just about the silo itself. It was about understanding the psychology of warfare through the lens of agriculture. On a farm, everything had multiple purposes. A barn wasn't just shelter for animals. It was storage, workshop, and observation point all at once. A fence wasn't merely a boundary. It was a windbreak, a framework for climbing plants, a landmark for navigation, and a silo, which most soldiers saw as nothing more than a tall container for grain, was actually a fortress, thick-walled, elevated, defensible, and utterly invisible in its mundane familiarity. Ray had grown up moving through these structures instinctively, climbing ladders to check grain levels, perching in high places to watch for storms or predators, and he brought that spatial awareness into combat with devastating effect. He understood sightlines in a way that urban soldiers didn't, understood how elevation changed angles, how shadows moved across fields at different times of day, how sound carried differently across open farmland versus forest. He had spent his childhood hunting groundhogs that damaged crops, learning to judge wind and distance, perfecting the art of the patient shot. And by the time he was 17, he was winning shooting competitions across northern Wisconsin. His father used to joke that Ray could shoot the dew off a blade of grass at 200 yards, and while that was an exaggeration, it wasn't much of one. When Ray enlisted in 1942, it wasn't out of patriotism or adventure. It was guilt. 2 of his cousins had died in the Pacific, boys he'd grown up with, boys who used to help with the harvest and swim in the creek behind his family's property. And their deaths had carved something hollow inside him that no amount of farm work could fill. He joined the Army in January, trained at Camp McCoy through the brutal Wisconsin winter, and by spring he was at Fort Benning learning the craft of military sniping. The training at Benning was methodical, professional, and entirely divorced from anything Ray had experienced in Wisconsin. They taught him about ballistics tables and range estimation, about camouflage and stalking, about breathing control and trigger discipline. They taught him to think like a predator, to move like a ghost, to kill without remorse or hesitation. But they didn't teach him about silos. They didn't teach him about using the landscape itself as both weapon and shield. That knowledge came from somewhere deeper, from the years of intimate familiarity with rural architecture, and it would prove to be the difference between survival and capture. Ray shipped out to England in March of 1944, part of the massive buildup before D-Day, and landed on Omaha Beach on June 7th, one day after the initial assault. The beach was still littered with bodies and wrecked equipment. The sand stained dark, and the air smelled of cordite and salt and death. He moved inland with his unit through the hedgerow country of the Cotentin Peninsula, where every field was a potential killing ground and every sunken lane was a natural trench. The Germans fought with savage efficiency, their machine gun nests positioned to create overlapping fields of fire, their snipers picking off American officers and radio men with methodical precision. Ray's unit took casualties daily, losing sergeants and lieutenants to bullets that seemed to come from nowhere, and morale began to crack under the constant attrition. That was when Ray started paying attention to the farms. They were everywhere in Normandy, these small family holdings with their stone houses and wooden barns and tall cylindrical silos. Most had been abandoned when the fighting started, their owners fled or killed, their livestock scattered or slaughtered. The structures stood empty and ignored, tactical afterthoughts in a landscape dominated by hedgerows and roads. But Ray saw something else. He saw elevation without the exposure of rooftops. He saw concealment without the vulnerability of foxholes. He saw firing positions that could dominate entire sectors while remaining effectively invisible. And most importantly, he saw that the Germans, despite their tactical sophistication, were looking for snipers in all the usual places. In trees, in windows, in bell towers, but never in grain silos. It was such a simple oversight, so obvious once you saw it, but it required thinking like a farmer rather than a soldier, and that was Ray's edge. On June 12th, after his unit had been pinned down for 2 days by German positions around a small village, Ray made his proposal to his commanding officer. He wanted to spend a night in an abandoned silo on the edge of the German perimeter, observe their patterns, and start taking out their leadership. His CO was skeptical but desperate, and he gave Ray permission with the understanding that if he got himself killed, nobody was going to mount a rescue operation. Ray took his Springfield, his ammunition, 1 canteen, and a sandbag, and that night he crawled across 400 yards of open ground to reach the silo. The interior was pitch black when he entered, the darkness so complete that he had to feel his way along the walls. The floor was uneven, covered in a thin layer of old grain that crunched softly underfoot, and the air was stale and thick. He climbed the internal ladder slowly, testing each rung before trusting it with his weight, until he reached a platform about 30 feet up. From there he could see nothing, but he could hear everything: the distant rumble of artillery, the occasional burst of machine gun fire, the voices of German soldiers drifting through the ventilation slots. He settled into position, arranged his sandbag as a rifle rest, and waited for dawn. When the first light came, it entered through the slots in narrow golden beams, illuminating the dust that hung suspended in the air, and Ray got his first clear view of the German positions. There were more than he expected, more than his maps had indicated, and they were dug in with professional thoroughness. But from his elevated position, he could see patterns that were invisible from ground level. He could see which soldiers moved between positions, carrying orders or supplies. He could see which tents had radio antennas. He could see officers consulting maps, pointing, directing. And he could see that not one of them was looking up at the silo. The first kill came late in the afternoon of that first day. A German major stepped out of a command tent to stretch, his uniform crisp despite the dirt and chaos around him, and Ray put a bullet through his neck at 280 yards. The sound of the shot echoed strangely inside the silo, a flat crack that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, and Ray watched through his scope as the Germans below scrambled for cover. They fired blindly into the hedgerows. They shouted orders. They sent a patrol to investigate a barn they thought might be harboring the sniper. But they didn't check the silo. That night, Ray stayed in position, drinking sparingly from his canteen, fighting the cramps in his legs, listening to the Germans below as they tried to reorganize. He could hear their frustration, their confusion, and he knew he had created an advantage. The next morning he killed a radio operator, and in the afternoon he killed a lieutenant. Each shot was carefully planned, taken only when he had absolute certainty, and each one deepened the chaos in the German command structure. Without reliable leadership, the soldiers below became hesitant, defensive, less coordinated. Ray's own unit noticed the change and began to press forward, gaining ground they hadn't been able to take in days. And still, nobody looked at the silo. By the third day, Ray had refined his technique to near perfection. He learned to time his shots to coincide with artillery fire or other loud noises, masking the sound. He learned which angles gave him the best sightlines while minimizing his exposure. He learned to recognize the subtle differences in German uniforms that indicated rank and specialty. Most importantly, he learned to embrace the isolation and discomfort of the silo as necessary conditions for success. This wasn't glamorous work. It wasn't heroic in any traditional sense. It was slow, methodical, brutal in its patience, and it required a kind of mental endurance that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with sheer stubbornness. Ray had that stubbornness in abundance, inherited from generations of Wisconsin farmers who had learned to endure blizzards and droughts and economic collapse without complaint. He thought of his father, who once worked 16-hour days during harvest season without a word of protest, and he applied that same grim determination to his task. Sleep came in brief snatches, never more than an hour at a time, and he ate only when his stomach cramps became unbearable. His uniform was soaked with sweat during the day and cold with moisture at night. His throat was raw from thirst. His eyes burned from the constant strain of looking through the scope. But he stayed. He watched. He waited. And he killed. The breakthrough came on the fourth day when Ray observed a German colonel arriving at the command tent. The man was older, gray-haired, and carried himself with the authority of someone used to command. He wore the distinctive insignia of a regimental commander, and his presence suggested that the Germans were trying to reorganize their forces after the chaos of the previous days. Ray watched him for 2 hours, noting his movements, his habits, the way he stood when reviewing maps. And then, when the colonel stepped into the open to speak with a subordinate, Ray took the shot. The bullet struck the colonel in the chest, and he fell backward into the arms of a nearby soldier. The reaction was immediate and electric. Officers ran toward the body. Radio operators began sending frantic messages. Soldiers poured out of defensive positions, forming a protective ring around the command tent. And in that moment of confusion and fear, Ray realized he had done something profound. He hadn't just killed an enemy. He had decapitated an entire command structure. Without the colonel, without clear leadership, the German positions began to fall apart. Orders went undelivered. Reinforcements arrived at the wrong locations. Machine gun nests ceased coordinating their fire. Ray's unit exploited the confusion ruthlessly, pushing forward through sectors that had been impassable just days before, and by evening they had broken through the German perimeter entirely. When Ray finally climbed down from the silo that night, his legs barely able to support his weight, he found his commanding officer waiting for him with an expression somewhere between awe and disbelief. Ray had spent 4 days in that silo. He had taken 14 confirmed kills, all of them high-value targets, and he had done it without suffering a single casualty or compromising his position. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary success. But Ray wasn't interested in congratulations. He was interested in repeating it. Over the next 2 weeks, Ray refined his silo sniping technique into a genuine tactical system. He began by scouting farms in advance of offensive operations, identifying silos with good sight lines and structural integrity. He learned to assess them quickly, looking for specific features. Ventilation slots positioned high enough to provide cover, walls thick enough to stop return fire, internal platforms or ladders that would allow rapid repositioning. He discovered that metal silos, though less common, offered even better protection than wooden ones, their corrugated steel capable of deflecting small arms fire and even some shrapnel. He developed a standard loadout: rifle, 100 rounds of ammunition, 2 canteens, 3 K-rations, a trench knife for cutting observation ports, and a sandbag for stabilization. He trained himself to enter and exit silos without leaving obvious traces, to move through them silently despite the echoing acoustics, to estimate range and windage from elevated positions where the usual ground-level reference points didn't apply. And most importantly, he began teaching other snipers in his unit, passing on the knowledge that no manual had ever contained. The technique spread. By July, there were 6 American snipers using silos across the Cotentin Peninsula, and by August the practice had become common enough that German intelligence reports began mentioning Turmschützen, tower shooters, as a distinct threat. But the Germans never quite adapted. Their tactical doctrine didn't include procedures for clearing farm structures, and their snipers remained focused on traditional hides. The result was a steady attrition of German leadership that contributed significantly to the collapse of organized resistance in the region. Ray's personal tally by the end of June was 37 confirmed kills, 24 of them officers. But the number didn't capture the full impact of what he had accomplished. Each officer killed represented not just a single casualty but a disruption of command, a break in communication, a moment of vulnerability that could be exploited. When Ray killed a company commander, that company lost coordination. When he killed a radio operator, entire units lost contact with headquarters. When he killed a mortar team leader, artillery fire became inaccurate and scattered. The cumulative effect was devastating, and it manifested in ways that couldn't be measured by body counts alone. American casualties dropped in sectors where Ray operated. Advances happened more quickly. German prisoners reported widespread confusion and low morale. And all of it stemmed from a simple innovation, using farm buildings the way they had always been meant to be used, as vantage points for surveying large areas of land, except now the surveying came with a rifle scope and the harvest was measured in enemy dead. Ray never saw it as genius. To him, it was just common sense, the application of rural logic to military problems, and he was baffled when other soldiers treated it as revolutionary. Of course you used the silo, he thought. Where else would you go? What else would you use? The fact that an entire army had overlooked this possibility spoke more to urban blindness than rural insight, and Ray felt no particular pride in pointing out the obvious. The psychological toll of silo sniping was considerable, though Ray rarely spoke about it. The isolation was profound, hours spent in darkness with only his thoughts and the distant sounds of war, and there were moments when the solitude became almost unbearable. He would find himself talking silently to his rifle, to his father, to his dead cousins, holding conversations in his mind just to maintain some connection to humanity. The kills themselves bothered him less than he expected. He had grown up slaughtering hogs and cattle, had learned early that death was a necessary part of farm life, and he applied that same unsentimental pragmatism to combat. The Germans he killed weren't people in his mind. They were problems to be solved, obstacles to be removed, targets that required only accuracy and patience. But the waiting, the endless, excruciating waiting, wore on him in ways that physical danger never did. There were times when he wanted nothing more than to stand up, to stretch, to feel sunlight on his face, but discipline held him in place. There were times when thirst became so intense that he fantasized about rain, about cool water, about the pump behind his family's farmhouse where the water always tasted faintly of iron. And there were times, particularly in the cold hours before dawn, when fear crept in and he imagined German soldiers climbing the ladder below him, imagined the silo becoming his tomb rather than his fortress. But he never left his position prematurely. He never compromised a mission out of discomfort or fear, and he never let his emotions interfere with his aim. By the middle of July, as the American breakout from Normandy accelerated, Ray's technique had become formalized enough that the Army began incorporating it into sniper training. Officers who had seen the results started requesting silos be cleared and secured during offensive operations, and combat engineers began modifying farm structures specifically to serve as sniper hides. The improvisation had become doctrine, though Ray himself was never officially credited. His name appeared in unit reports and after-action reviews, but always buried in lists of personnel, never highlighted, never decorated. He received no medals for his innovation, no public recognition, no promotion beyond the rank he had earned through standard progression. This wasn't unusual. The vast majority of wartime innovations came from soldiers in the field who simply did what needed to be done and then moved on to the next objective. But it meant that Ray Kuzlowski's contribution to sniper warfare remained largely invisible, known to his immediate comrades but lost to wider military history. And Ray didn't care. He had never sought glory. He had sought effectiveness, and he had achieved it in ways that saved American lives and shortened the campaign. That was enough. The technique proved even more effective as the war moved eastward into Belgium and Germany. The farms there were similar to those in Normandy, and silos remained common features of the rural landscape. American snipers continued to use them throughout the fall and winter of 1944, and the Germans never developed an adequate countermeasure. They tried demolishing silos during retreats, but there were too many to destroy systematically. They tried posting guards near farm structures, but that only created more targets for American fire teams. They tried incorporating silo clearance into their defensive protocols, but by then the practice had spread so widely that it became impossible to secure every potential sniper position. The result was a persistent advantage for American forces, a small but significant edge that contributed to the overall momentum of the advance. Declassified intelligence reports from the post-war period show that German commanders were aware of the threat and frustrated by their inability to counter it. One report from December 1944 describes enemy snipers operating from elevated agricultural structures with devastating effect on officer casualties, and recommends immediate destruction of all silos in defensive sectors. But the recommendation was never implemented effectively, and American snipers continued to exploit the tactic until the war's end. Ray himself survived the war with barely a scratch. He fought through France, Belgium, and into Germany, using silos whenever possible but also adapting to other environments when necessary. He killed men in forests and cities, from church steeples and factory roofs, in all the traditional sniper positions that the Army manuals prescribed. But he was always most effective in silos, where his farm-trained instincts gave him an edge that no amount of military training could replicate. He was present at the liberation of several concentration camps in the spring of 1945, an experience that shattered whatever romantic notions about war he might have retained, and he was in Bavaria when Germany surrendered in May. When he finally returned to Wisconsin in the fall of 1945, he found his family's farm exactly as he had left it, as though the war had been some distant dream that hadn't touched the real world at all. His father met him at the train station, shook his hand once and said, "Good to have you back." They never discussed what Ray had done overseas. They never spoke about the kills or the medals he hadn't received or the innovation that had quietly changed modern warfare. They simply went back to work, planting and harvesting, tending the animals, fixing equipment, living the slow, rhythmic life that farms demanded. And Ray was grateful for that silence. He had seen enough. He had done enough. And he wanted nothing more than to return to the mundane comfort of groundhog hunting and grain storage and the simple predictability of agricultural seasons. The broader impact of Ray's innovation became clear in the years following the war, though he never knew it. The U.S. Army conducted extensive after-action analyses of sniper effectiveness during the European campaign, and the data showed striking results. In sectors where silo sniping had been employed, German officer casualties were 40% higher than in comparable sectors without the tactic. American casualties were correspondingly lower, and territorial gains happened more quickly. The numbers were significant enough that the Army updated its field manuals to include guidance on using non-traditional elevated structures as sniper positions, with specific mention of silos, water towers, and other agricultural buildings. But the manuals never credited Ray by name. They never told the story of the Wisconsin farm boy who had figured out how to turn everyday rural architecture into a weapon of war. The innovation was absorbed into doctrine as though it had always been there, another piece of institutional knowledge with no clear origin, and Ray's contribution faded into the anonymity that claims most wartime innovations. This was partly intentional. The Army preferred to present tactics as the result of systematic analysis rather than individual inspiration, believing that institutional credit created better morale and discipline than hero worship. But it was also simply the nature of bureaucracy, which smoothed away individual contributions in favor of collective advancement. Decades later, when military historians began conducting oral history interviews with World War II veterans, a few of Ray's former comrades mentioned the silo technique, and gradually the story began to emerge. By then Ray was in his 70s, still living on the same Wisconsin farm, still hunting groundhogs, still reluctant to discuss the war. When reporters occasionally contacted him, he gave brief, factual answers devoid of emotion or self-promotion. Yes, he had used silos. No, he didn't think it was particularly innovative. Yes, he had killed German officers. No, he didn't remember how many. The reporters usually left disappointed, looking for dramatic quotes or profound reflections on the nature of war, and finding only a laconic old farmer who saw his wartime service as a job that had needed doing and was now finished. But a few researchers persisted, cross-referencing unit records and after-action reports, interviewing other veterans, piecing together a more complete picture. They found that Ray's confirmed kill count, while impressive, was only part of the story. The real impact came from the tactical shift he had initiated, the way his improvisation had spread through the army and fundamentally altered how snipers approached farm country. That shift had saved lives, had shortened campaigns, had contributed to victory in ways that couldn't be measured by body counts but were no less real for being invisible. The question of recognition became more complicated as Ray aged. Some of his advocates argued that he deserved retroactive decoration, perhaps even the Medal of Honor, for actions that had clearly gone above and beyond the call of duty. But the military bureaucracy moved slowly, and the burden of proof for wartime decorations was high, particularly decades after the fact. Ray's own reluctance to pursue recognition made matters worse. He refused to provide detailed accounts of his kills, refused to name specific officers he had eliminated, refused to participate in the kind of self-promotion that might have generated sufficient public pressure to force a review. His position was simple. He had done his duty, other men had done theirs, and singling him out would dishonor the collective effort that had won the war. This attitude was common among his generation, particularly among rural veterans who saw individual recognition as both unnecessary and slightly embarrassing. But it also meant that Ray's story remained obscure, known to a small circle of military historians and sniper instructors but largely forgotten by the wider public. Modern sniper training now includes instruction on using elevated agricultural structures, though the origins of the technique are rarely discussed. Snipers learn to assess silos for structural integrity, sight lines, and concealment value, just as Ray did 70 years ago. They learn to modify ventilation slots, to position themselves for maximum effectiveness, to exploit the psychological blind spot that keeps enemies from looking up at ordinary farm buildings. The technique has been used in conflicts from Vietnam to Afghanistan, adapted to different architectural styles and tactical situations but fundamentally unchanged from Ray's original improvisation. And in that sense, Ray Kuzlowski's legacy is profound and enduring, even if his name isn't attached to it. He taught the American military to see the battlefield through a farmer's eyes, to recognize that every structure has tactical potential if you understand its original purpose, and that innovation often comes from applying civilian knowledge to military problems rather than the other way around. Ray died in 2003 at the age of 84, never having received formal recognition for his wartime innovations, never having sought it, never having expressed regret about its absence. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his military service in a single line, focusing instead on his 60 years of farming, his championship marksmanship in civilian competitions, his service to the local 4-H club. The silo he had first used in Normandy is gone now, demolished decades ago, and the farm where he spent 11 hours in darkness is probably under pavement or housing developments. The men he killed are remembered, if at all, as statistics in German casualty reports, their families long since passed, their stories absorbed into the vast collective tragedy of the war. And Ray himself has faded into history, another veteran whose contributions were real and significant but never quite dramatic enough for popular memory. But the technique remains, passed down through generations of snipers, refined and adapted but never fundamentally changed. A quiet testament to a Wisconsin farm boy who understood that the key to winning a war might be as simple as knowing how to properly use a grain silo. The story of Raymond Kuzlowski is ultimately a story about invisibility, about innovations that work precisely because they remain unnoticed, about heroes who succeed by becoming part of the landscape, about legacies that endure even when the names behind them are forgotten. Ray spent his war in darkness, in silence, in positions where nobody thought to look, and he killed with patience born of farm work and precision learned from hunting groundhogs. He saved lives through methods that seemed obvious in retrospect but required genuine insight to discover. He changed warfare without changing his fundamental nature, remaining throughout his service and his life afterward exactly what he had always been. A farmer who understood that good work doesn't require recognition, that effectiveness matters more than glory, and that some of the most important victories are the ones that nobody ever sees. His story asks uncomfortable questions about how we recognize and remember military service, about whose innovations get recorded and whose get absorbed into institutional memory, about the difference between the dramatic heroism we celebrate and the quiet competence that actually wins wars. And it reminds us that sometimes the most effective warriors are not the ones who embrace violence most enthusiastically, but the ones who approach it with the same patient, methodical determination they would bring to any difficult job, the ones who see killing not as glory but as grim necessity, who take no joy in their work but do it thoroughly nonetheless, who understand that war, like farming, is ultimately about survival, about getting through to the next season, about doing what needs to be done so that others can live. If you found Ray Kuzlowski's story as compelling as I did, I'd be grateful if you'd take a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. It helps more people discover these incredible forgotten stories from history. What do you think about Ray's innovation? Should a tactic that saved countless American lives and fundamentally changed sniper warfare be more widely known? And here's something to think about. Do you believe Ray Kuzlowski deserves to finally be officially recognized for his contribution to military history, even though he never sought that recognition himself? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.